Hi, Brannon.
Hi, Bob. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. I'm fine.
I should tell people that you're Professor Brannon Wheeler of the U.S. Naval Academy, and you're the director of the Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies there. Is that right?
Yes, that's right, Bob.
And are you in Annapolis right now?
Actually, just outside of Annapolis, a small town called Davidsonville.
Uh-huh. And how's the weather there?
It's actually pretty nice. It's in the 40s, but we were in Southern California this last week, and we were hoping it would be warmer there, but it was only in the 50s and 40s there as well.
Ah, what's the difference?
Yeah, well, there we have the ocean. It's a little nicer than here.
There are differences, and then there's the humidity, but this time of year, that's not much of a factor. Well, thanks for joining us. We're going to talk about Sharia, which I guess can be described in a shorthand kind of way as Islamic law. And I guess the reason it's of growing interest to people is that it's being used more and more in political discourse in America. Most notably, there's some people like Newt Gingrich who contend that we are at risk of having Sharia imposed upon us. And I guess you've been keeping track of this, or this kind of stuff naturally comes to your attention in your line of work.
Well, Bob, that's right. A lot of my research is in classical Islamic law and in the early history of Islam. But as the director of the Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies, the Naval Academy, I work with a lot of people who work with contemporary issues. And of course, as you mentioned, Sharia and Islamic law are in the news these days. And so you hear a lot about it just by reading the newspaper and by going online. And so these are issues that are of interest to me, not only because of my own research in the field, but also just because of my participation in our country.
Mm-hmm. And what do you, in the course of seeing what people are saying about this, are there misconceptions about Sharia that kind of leap out at you, or you think
yeah, I think there are, and I think that's probably true of any politicized discourse, especially when you take something as complex as Islamic legal tradition, something that's lasted for, even at a conservative estimate, at least 1,200, maybe 1,000 years, covered pretty much the entire world. To simplify that into even a 100-page document or to talk about it in a quick soundbite, you're always going to be oversimplifying. And if you also have behind that a kind of a political agenda, then distortions are going to occur. And of course, it's also going to occur because people are concerned, and the type of rhetoric that we hear is often emotional rhetoric, or it's a rhetoric that's designed to elicit responses from people.
Mm-hmm. And what, I mean, if somebody asks you for a 1 or 2 sentence definition of Sharia, a little longer than the phrase Islamic law, what would you tell them?
Well, I actually like the term definition of practice rather than law, because Sharia encompasses a lot more than what we would in contemporary United States consider to be law.
Mm-hmm.
Sharia is basically the way in which Muslims define what the ideal practice should be. But two of the most important things to understand about Sharia is, number one, that there is, especially, we can talk a little bit more, but outside of Shi'i Islam, outside of that, there is no single authority. So there's no single person like the Pope to whom you can go and say, what is the final decision on this? What is the correct practice? Or is this wrong, or is this right? So that's one really important thing, Bob. The other one is that...
And can I just say, to clarify, and most American Muslims would be Sunni, I gather, and therefore in that tradition that lacks a centralized authority, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
And then within Shi'i Islam, there is no single centralized authority either, but it's a little more complicated, and we can come back to that if you want. The second really important thing to understand is that Sharia is always applied. There's no text out there that's called Sharia. You can't go into the library and get a copy of it. The Ottomans a few centuries ago tried to codify the Sharia. The British in India tried to do it when they were ruling their Muslim subjects. But there is no single book that you could say this is Islamic law. And so I think those are probably two of the major misconceptions that you hear, and whether or not you hear it directly or that people's statements seem to be based upon assuming those things to be true. I think it causes a lot of misperception.
But it is, I gather that, so it's a product of interpretation. And I gather that what's being interpreted is, among other things, the Quran, right, and also the sayings of the prophet, and the reputed practices of the prophet. I mean, that is supposed to be the foundation for what is defined as proper under Sharia. Is that right?
Yes, that's right, Bob. Islamic legal theorists have a far more complicated version than what we could go into here. And in fact, I'll make reference to a book that I like, which is by a guy named Mohammed Kamali, called Principles of Islamic Jurisprudence, in which he outlines some 40 different sources for Islamic law that have been used over the years. But you're right. Primarily, Islamic law is an interpretive practice, and it's interpretation of two main textual sources. And by textual, I don't necessarily mean written, but of course today it's not oral any longer. But the first one being the Quran, which is regarded by Muslims as being the revealed word of God. And the second one being, as you referred to, the practices and the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. And that's normally called the Sunnah. And again, there's no book called the Sunnah, but Sunnah means the example or the model of the Prophet Muhammad. And that Sunnah, that model, is only known through reports of what people said that the Prophet said or the Prophet did. And those reports, the Arabic word for a report is called a hadith. So the word hadith just means report, and there are literally hundreds of thousands of reports of things that the Prophet Muhammad said or did during his lifetime. And so Muslim jurists would interpret the Quran through the lens of the practices and the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad at the most basic level.
Okay, so there's a lot of room for interpretation in the articulation of Sharia. At the same time, it's probably safe to say that under any kind of mainstream interpretation, Sharia would be a set of laws or norms that most Americans would probably not be comfortable with, right? I mean, if it were the case that Sharia, as it's defined in by the majority of Muslims, were going to be imposed on the people of Oklahoma, it would probably result in something they were not happy with, right?
Well, I'm not sure, Bob. It depends on exactly what we're talking about here. So let me just step back one step and explain that when people talk about Islamic law, as I said, there's no book that you can go out and get and say this is the definition of what people should practice. But there are textbooks that were used, even 1,000 years ago, and there are textbooks that are used today. Sometimes they're the same ones that are used in what we would commonly refer to as a madrasa, which is kind of like a law school. You go to law school and you want to become educated, not in what the law is, but what are the sources for the law, and how do you interpret it and apply it. So you learn that by looking at how other people did it in the past. What sources did they use? How did they go about interpreting it? What were some of the cases? And sometimes the cases might be the same, but usually they're just analogous cases. Okay. Those textbooks, if you look at them, they're generally divided into two sections. And Muslim scholars talk about the first section of that as ritual law. Again, I don't like to use the word law, but definition of ritual practice. And then what's called social practices. So the ritual section, which is always at the beginning, and it's not as long as the other part, deals with the 5 major things that Muslims need to know when practicing their religion. So it includes purification, which is necessary for any other ritual practice. It includes prayer. It includes fasting and the giving of alms, and then the pilgrimage to Mecca. And so each one of those 5 things is defined or discussed, perhaps is a better way of talking about it, in these legal textbooks.
Okay.
And then the larger section, which we call social law, deals with a lot of different topics.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those topics would be coterminous with what we consider to be law in the United States today. So there's always a criminal legal section. There's a section on inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
There's a section on marriage laws. And there's a section, which is usually the largest one, on commercial law, which deals with buying and selling and loans and all sorts of different sorts of things. And then there's the section that everyone likes to talk about, which usually is a very small section in there, which is usually called jihad or CR. And CR is just another Arabic word which means campaigns. Mm-hmm. And that section of Islamic law is not strictly about the conduct of war. It's often been described, probably more accurately, as a section that deals with international relations. Mm-hmm. So relations between among Muslim communities, and then between Muslim communities and non-Muslim communities. So people normally latch on to certain parts of mm-hmm. those definitions, and so the parts that you hear a lot about are the parts that are normally in criminal law, the parts that deal with punishment,
right.
that seem to us to be really severe,
right.
and then and just the inclusion of the section on international law or military conflict within a legal code seems strange to many Americans, because we don't have, we talk about just war theory, and we have the Geneva Conventions and other sorts of things that regulate how we conduct war. Mm-hmm. We don't generally, as a public, know about that unless we're engaged and in the military ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And then also the treatment of women gets a lot of attention when somebody's throwing out the prospect of Sharia kind of being imposed somewhere in America. And maybe at this point we should step back. I mean, we've been talking about Sharia as if maybe it were some kind of live prospect that it's going to be imposed somewhere in America. So maybe we should step back and get your view on that. I think you want to say somewhere along the line, and this is probably as good a place as any, that your views don't represent those of the U.S. Naval Academy or the Navy or anything else, right?
Yes, that's right, Bob. So I am a scholar, and I do teach there and direct the center, but the views I'm expressing now are just my own personal views.
Right. You were at the University of Washington before this, and so this is just a place you're teaching right now.
Yes, that's correct.
But I mean, what is the the kind of the people who are kind of talking a lot about this? There's Newt Gingrich, and then there's Frank Gaffney, who runs what's this thing called the Center for Security Policy, which issued a big report. I don't know if you've seen this thing, Sharia: the Threat to America.
Yes, I have, Bob.
Have you actually looked at the thing?
I haven't read it carefully, but I have looked at it. Yes.
Okay. Well, what's your take on what they're claiming is a serious prospect, and how likely kind of that is?
Well, Bob, it's really interesting, because when people talk about Islam, and perhaps it's in the politicized environment, maybe since September 11th, maybe since the elections back in 2008, I don't know exactly, but there's a tendency to not understand Islam as being similar to other religious traditions or other cultural practices that you might see in this country. And as you know, we have a country with a lot of different religious groups within it. And in fact, when I travel around the world, and even particularly in the Middle East, that's what impresses people the most, that we have so many different religious groups in this country, and we allow such a large amount of freedom for those groups to interact in our democracy and be a part of the society. Mm-hmm. So we do, if you step back and look at it, we do have different sets of rules that we have for different religious traditions. And it's been common in this country for Catholics, for example, to go to their church when talking about divorce. So you might go to most people, for example, don't go to a judge to get married. They want to get married in a church, and they want to have a priest perform that ceremony, or a pastor. In Judaism, for example, there are certain rules that if you're an observant Orthodox Jew or even a Reformed Jew, you would have to observe those rules. You couldn't just get a divorce by the state, but you'd also have to have the rabbi confirm that divorce, and there would be certain things that you'd have to do. Mm-hmm. Of course, the Latter-day Saints have their own rules about things as well. So if there's a large Muslim community somewhere in the United States and they want to get married according to Islamic law, well, that doesn't contradict state law at that point. So they might require that there be two witnesses there when the marriage contract is drawn up, and they might say something other than "I do" to each other when drawing up the contract between them. And then afterwards, they register it with the state, the same way that, say, when my wife and I got married, we had a minister who presided over the ceremony, but then we also had to register our marriage with the state. So there is a tradition in this country and in other countries around the world, in Europe and other places, where there's a kind of secondary religious court system that kind of goes on in the background. And as long as that doesn't supersede the civil authority of the state or the federal government, then I don't see that there's any contradiction there.
Right. And I mean, come to think of it, there was a time back when a Catholic would have been reluctant to get a divorce if they couldn't get the marriage annulled in the first place. Or they would, in fact, I guess they wouldn't call it. That was a way of not having to call it divorce. But of course, all this applies, all this is a question of believers applying traditions and strictures to themselves within, in a sense, within their religious community. And what people are getting scared about in America is the prospect that non-Muslims would have Sharia in some sense. Well, I guess both scenarios are being floated. I think broadly speaking, there are people who are afraid that, Sharia will be imposed ultimately on their community. And I think even in that report we alluded to, there is the prospect thrown out there that, that complete takeover of the American legal system is the long-term goal of some people, right? But certainly a fear out there that's being fanned is that Sharia would be imposed on non-Muslims. And then I guess secondarily, there is the concern that Muslims could come to be under the governance of a separate kind of law in a way that was really problematic. And there you might think of the treatment of women as one issue that would come up, right? So I mean, yes. The concerns that are out there are not about things that would be all that comparable to the sorts of governance that take place within our religious communities traditionally, right?
Well, again, I think that it's all a matter of exactly what we're talking about. So, so one of the problems with the report to which you referred is that it goes through a number of different texts that have been written over the past 1,200 years, and it just picks out of them certain discussions. See, Muslim jurists, the same way that, say, rabbis might do, they sit around and they discuss legal issues. And they do that as a like a liberal arts education. You pull out an issue that's controversial, you think the students will have an opinion about it, so you can get everyone talking about it, and then you start talking about the issue. And in the course of talking about the issue, you really want to do two things. What you don't want to do is you don't want to tell the students this is what the answer is for all time and place. What you want to do is you want to get the students to see, here's the basis for where we get our ideas about what's the correct practice. So you want to teach them about looking at hadith, looking at the Quran, and how those things are interpreted and how past scholars have done that interpretation. And then you want to teach them to be able to argue points rationally based upon that type of evidence. So it's not that different than what you'd encounter if you went to a law school in this country. You could say, well, our law is based on the Constitution, but you can't just whip out the Constitution and then say, hey, the Constitution says you can't drive faster than 65 miles an hour. Because the Constitution doesn't say that. So you have to figure out, well, how did they get that law from the Constitution? Well, there's a lot of steps in between there. So what happens is that when you get these legal textbooks, they're discussing all these different issues, and the problem with some of the views, the problem with that report, is that they take those instances and then they reify them, and they say, well, I found this in a text that's 600 years old, and all Muslims believe this for all time and place. And we don't even know that 400 years ago, 600 years ago, when the text was written, that anybody followed that practice. It was just part of the intellectual discussion that was going on at the time.
So So
Yeah, go ahead.
the report by the Center for Security Policy, it sounds like you would not say was compiled under the guidance of someone who actually understood Islam.
Well, Bob, it's hard to know, and again, I would want to read it very carefully, and I would want to make a more careful judgment than that. But from what I've seen, the book, the report quotes a lot from texts that are hundreds, centuries old, and it reifies those statements, and it basically implies, if not explicitly makes the statement, that if something's found in a legal text written by any Muslim at any time, that therefore it applies to all Muslims to all time and places, and that's just not the case.
Okay. And of course we should say what may be obvious, that the idea that Islamic law is going to be imposed imposed on America seems not likely to happen anytime soon, given the fact that America is a democracy and almost everyone in it is not a Muslim, right? I mean, it's and I don't know, maybe you don't agree that this fear is actually out there, but I kind of think that, Oklahoma passed this referendum saying Sharia, can never prevail in Oklahoma or something. Isn't it your sense that there are people out there that really imagine Sharia being imposed on them?
Well, Bob, you're right. There's of course there's people who imagine a lot of things too, but I think that I think one thing we need to consider. Let's take, for example, there's a lot of countries in the world today where Muslims do form a majority of the population, and many of those countries are not ruled by Islamic law. You could take Turkey, for example. You could take Syria or Egypt, or even take a country like Kuwait, where their constitution says that one of the main sources of law in this country is Sharia, is Islamic law. But yet that doesn't. One couldn't say that, hey, you daily see people being having their hands cut off in the streets in Kuwait, or any of the other things that you hear about happening. So I think to talk about that, the what we could even call the most extreme or the most ridiculous, if you will, statements about Sharia law, which I'm not going to say they were never practiced and people don't talk about them, but to say that those would suddenly somehow be imposed in a country as diverse and as broad as the United States, when you don't even see it being imposed in countries that are 99% Muslim, who've had a 1,400-year history of being 99% Muslim, it just seems a little far-fetched to me. Right.
Well, it makes me wonder how many countries really are governed in a straightforward sense by Sharia. I mean, Pakistan is not, right? I assume Saudi Arabia is. How many? What are some of the other countries that are or are not really governed by Sharia? Muslim countries, I mean.
Well, Bob, it's a really good question, and it's a complex answer too, and it's probably the only way to answer it would be to go society by society and try to look at it. But you can put things maybe in a more general sense on a scale. But one of the things that we have to try to understand is that, as I was talking about what's contained in what people discuss when they talk about legal issues, some of that is ritual issues. So the governments are not forcing people to go out and pray 5 times a day.
Right.
They're not forcing people to go on the pilgrimage or forcing people to fast during Ramadan. And in fact, part of Islamic tradition is very clear about the fact that the leader of the Muslim community has to provide for the free exercise of religion. It doesn't say you have to make sure people are doing the religion that you think they're supposed to do, but to provide for the free exercise of that religion. And that could include, in countries like Saudi Arabia, maintaining the facilities where people can go and perform the pilgrimage. So the government's responsible to maintain a place where people can go and do that ritual and make sure it's safe for them to do that. Okay. And then there's other parts of Islamic law where we could talk about marriage, for example, where there are many countries where, although marriage is described in Islamic law and there's a particular ceremony that's to take place, the government doesn't prefer to do it that way. So in Egypt, for example, there have been a number of cases where the government has said, look, you have to register your marriage with us. And if you don't register the marriage with us, well, then we're not going to know for sure that your heirs are who they say they are. So even in the countries where we could talk about Islamic law as being enshrined in the Constitution, as being a major source or even the major source of legislation in the country, take Saudi Arabia, for example, you have to figure out what does that mean, because there is no book somewhere that says this is what Sharia is.
Right.
So you can't simply have a book in a room and then have a guy walk in there and say, okay, on page 12 it says you did this and here's the consequence of what you did. You need to have people who are, I guess you could describe a country governed by Islamic law, and I'm not sure this actually exists anywhere, but as a country where the government would cede its authority to a group of scholars who would then be responsible for interpreting canonical sources, past authoritative scriptural and other sources, to try to determine what general principles would be contained in those sources, and then how those general principles apply to whatever particular case they're being asked to adjudicate.
Well, Iran, of course, Iran's not a Sunni Muslim nation, but would that be kind of in that ballpark?
Well, Iran is a really interesting case, Bob, and part of that is, as you said, that the majority of Muslims in Iran are Shi'i Muslims of the so-called Twelver or Imami Shia type, and they have a little different tradition of jurisprudence. In part, that's because before the 12th Imam disappeared, the Shia community had a living representative to whom they could go and they could ask questions and get a definitive answer on what our correct practice would be. Once that 12th Imam disappears, there's a short period of time where that 12th Imam is in communication with certain people. But after that period stops, they go into what's called the period of hiding or occultation. And basically the Shi'i jurisprudence then reverts to what the Sunnis use, which is that you have to use texts, and you have to have a group of scholars who read those texts and try to interpret the texts to the best of their ability. And so people have heard about titles like Hujjat al-Islam or Ayatollah. And so within the Twelver Shi'i Islam, there is a kind of clerical hierarchy similar to what you would find in the Catholic Church, where if you have someone who's an Ayatollah, that person has more legal authority than somebody who's not. And so if you were just your average Joe saying, hey, I want to know whether this practice is allowed or not, am I allowed to take my skateboard into the mosque or not, you need to go to somebody who has recognized authority to answer that question, and you would need to go to someone like an Ayatollah. Okay. But there's more than one Ayatollah, Bob, in Iran. There are quite a few of them. And even though there is a supreme religious leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, in Iran, as you may have seen in the news, he doesn't make all the final decisions in the country. They have a democratically elected president, they have a parliament, and they have a complex legal system which actually, I guess you could say the Islamic law informs that system. And even though in theory it's a government that's supposed to be run by the jurists, that was Khomeini's idea when he came up with something called Vilayat al-Faqih, which is the guardianship of the jurist. It's not simply a case where you have a bunch of scholars sitting around to whom the rest of the elected government just cedes their authority.
Okay, and what about non-Islamic countries? I mean, these are the kind of Newt Gingrich's and Frank Gaffney's of the world. If you say to them, wait a second, this is crazy, the idea that Sharia is going to be imposed across America or in any significant part of America, one thing they say is, well, look at Europe, look at England. England is already headed down the path of, surrendering its legal soul to Islam or something. What are you very familiar with the situation in England, or the kinds of things they're referring to, or any other part of Europe?
Well, I wouldn't say I'm very familiar, but I know what I've read in some recent scholarship and in some newspapers and things. So I couldn't address the specifics, but insofar as it compares to what we've got in the United States, and then the general idea of how Islamic law is practiced or used in non-majority Muslim societies.
Okay. I mean, in England there is, I gather, something called a Muslim arbitration tribunal or something where Muslims can take certain civil cases to that as an alternative to the legal system or something. These wouldn't be criminal cases, but is that true or?
Well, I don't know that to be true, Bob, but that wouldn't surprise me because we do similar things in this country with other religious traditions.
Oh, we do?
If you want to resolve a dispute within your church, for example, you might choose to not go to a judge. You might choose to go to the pastor and have him make that decision for you. And the same goes for like we talked about before, for marriages and divorces and things of that sort.
I think it's true. And these are only civil cases. I mean, I read a little about this. So it's not as if you can opt out of the system of criminal prosecution in England if you're a Muslim. It's more like if two Muslims have a dispute and they want it resolved in a certain form and don't want to take it to court. Of course, you could also, in America, I mean, you can take a civil dispute to any number of fora outside of the government. You can agree that you're going to go on Judge Judy and abide by the finding, right?
Yeah, of course.
So I have not been able to find a very dramatic example in England that I would find frightening, but I maybe have not looked deeply enough. I don't know. So what kinds of things then are the most kind of plausible expressions of Sharia that you might find? Well, I should step back and say one place this issue comes up is when someone's proposing building a mosque, these initiatives have encountered resistance lately in a few places, not just the so-called Ground Zero Mosque in New York, but Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and a few other places. And when the resistance wells up, one thing you hear is, well, this is just an advance guard for Sharia, for, the coming wave of Sharia. What is the most thoroughgoing expression of Sharia you can imagine accompanying the establishment of a mosque in a local community? Is it just the kinds of quite innocuous sounding things you've mentioned, dealing with marriage issues and so on and divorce? Although even there, I would say, maybe advocates of women's rights would say that's not so innocuous. But, when you're because that has to do with the way women are treated in the home, and maybe that's worth talking about. But what could Americans living in a community reasonably expect, or what's the most reasonable fear you think they could have from the establishment of a mosque?
Well, that's a lot of different issues, Bob. But I think you can do two things. You can say that reasonably, what can we expect? And I would say reasonably, we can expect what we've got now. I mean, we've got some communities in this country that the area, the county, the city, whatever it is majority Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't see as people doing the sorts of apocalyptic sorts of things that we might expect from some of the heated rhetoric that we hear.
Mm-hmm.
And you could also imagine, if you want, some sort of cult-like group where everybody has to sign a statement saying, if I'm going to be a member of this particular church or whatever it is, I'm going to abide by their rules and promise that I will bring to arbitration within the church any problem that I have, with this person, or I'm going to agree that I'm not going to drink alcohol or drink caffeine to be a member of your society, and then you can abide by that. But in no case would those agreements would never be legally binding if they were said to supersede state law or federal law. So I can't imagine even the most extreme cult-like, to use the term loosely, arrangement to be something where those rules would then be imposed on other people who weren't voluntarily part of that community.
Mm-hmm. And what about the issue of the treatment of women? There's a case that I think Frank Gaffney talks about or is cited in this report or something that I could talk about a little that alarmed them, a finding in American court. As it happens, it was subsequently overturned, so there was nothing to worry about in the long run. But are there issues? Is there reason to think that? I mean, here's the question, maybe. If a Muslim woman was being, by the standards of American law, mistreated, is there a threat that she could not have recourse in the American courts?
Well, I don't see how that could happen, Bob, because if she's living in this country, if she's an American citizen, then she has equal protection under the law as every other person would have, and her civil rights would be the same as every other person. She might voluntarily say, as perhaps non-Muslim women do too, well, I don't choose to pursue a case against my husband who's abusing me, or whatever it might be, because I don't want to, whether it's for religious reasons or because I'm afraid or I love him and I don't think he really means it, or whatever it might be. But I think that the whole issue of the treatment of women in Islam is a really, really important one. And it's important because, on the one hand, of course, it's important that we try to continue to defend civil rights in this country and human rights around the world. I think those are important ideals that we need to strive for. Not that we know necessarily what they are, but we think we're working toward that. And I think also it's important because we need to try to understand that Islamic law doesn't dictate how women should be treated. And traditional societies and tribal societies and Arab societies, they don't dictate it either, but they influence it as well. So I'm sure you can think of lots of examples in this country where women don't have the same role, the same public role as men do. Say even in Orthodox Judaism or in other religious communities where even in some forms of what we might call evangelical Christianity, where women are not given leadership roles in the church, for example. So those are based on certain interpretations of Scripture. So I think that there's a wide variety of interpretations that one could look at, and a wide variety of influences in talking about the way that women are treated in Islam, or the way that the legal status that Muslim women tend to have around the world. And there's a lot of things that people don't understand or don't know about as well. For example, in Jordan and Iran, where there are seats in parliament that are reserved for women to make sure that women will be represented in the government. We don't have those sorts of things in this country, but I think those are just things that show that it's a complex and a complicated issue.
Okay, but when you say, as I think you said, that the way women are treated is not dictated by Sharia, I gather you just mean that there is there's no one unambiguous code for how women are treated, but rather, even where Sharia prevails, in the various places where Sharia prevails, the interpretations might be different. But I gather it is the fact that when Sharia is prevailing, the way women are treated is grounded in Islamic law, right?
Well, Bob, it's a tough question. I think what I would probably want to posit is that in societies where those, or I don't want society as a broad term, but in a society where the claim is being made that they're governing themselves according to Sharia, according to Islamic law, I think you could expect that that's a fairly conservative society. And so coinciding with that statement would also be a fairly culturally driven conservative view of family and of public displays of whatever it might be. So I think the two things come together, and they're not necessarily related. And as we discussed, the Islamic law is a matter of interpretation. You've got sources, and everyone agrees that we've got to use those sources, that we need to interpret them. And you might also have roughly a grouping of these are interpretive traditions or examples of interpretation in the past that we think exemplify how we should interpret those sources. But the result, the conclusions, are not fixed. So it just takes somebody with the notion ahead of time that, hey, I would like to find proof that it's not in fact okay to take your skateboard into the mosque, and now I'm going to go back into the text and I'm going to show that I'm right about this, as opposed to you can imagine a more, let's say, honest or detached person who says, well, I don't know what the sources say, I'm going to look and I'm going to see, and then I'm going to come back and give you an answer.
And on this point of, norms that prevail under the auspices of Islamic law, but may in fact be manifestations of other cultural forces, I've heard that the issue of honor killings, which of course doesn't prevail by any means in all Muslim societies anyway, but it seems to be more a product of certain, for example, some cultural traditions in South Asia that are largely separate from Islam and may eventually get commingled with Islamic tradition. But am I understanding that correctly? That honor killings have happened in Islamic and non-Islamic tradition in that area, and that they're no kind of straightforward expression of Islamic tradition?
Well, Bob, that's right. And we have to also recognize too that we use and scholars as well, we use terms pretty loosely. So when we talk about Islamic tradition, does that encompass Islamic law? Is that included in there? And when we talk about Islamic law, one of the sources of Islamic law is local tradition, so that it can be a source of it, it can be separate from it. But I think most Islamic legal jurists, or legal scholars, if you will, would agree with the statement that honor killing is not talked about in Sharia. It's not. There's no legal precedent for it in the Quran, and that it is a practice that seems to be tied to more tribal notions or perhaps a more conservative outlook on the family. And it really is a problem, and it's not just in South Asia but also in the Middle East. And sometimes the victim, well, I should say sometimes the person who commits the crime can resort to legal tricks, if you will, or legal loopholes that can sound like they're based on Islamic law. In Jordan, for example, there are alarmingly large number, even if it's only one, but there's an alarmingly large number of cases that have occurred in the past where honor killings occur, and the person who commits the crime is not prosecuted in the way that we would expect the person to be prosecuted in the United States. And sometimes the explanation that's given is because the person's being held to a standard that's not the civil legal standard, but in fact a standard that's based upon tribal law or on religious law.
Yeah, and a little bit related to that is this. I alluded to this case where there was an American court ruling that was subsequently overturned that some people found alarming, and it was a case where a guy had mistreated his wife. And what the judge found was not that the mistreatment was justified by Islamic law, but the guy's own conviction that he was governed by Islamic law meant that he was kind of not aware that he was violating American law or something like that. I just revisit that because I think I said earlier I would get into the details of that a little. But so it was never really a case of an American judge saying, yes, Islamic law prevails. It was rather a finding that the guy lacked culpability because he didn't realize he was violating American laws. In any event, that was overturned.
I would think so, because ignorance of the law is not an excuse.
No, I know. So I don't know really the details, but so maybe that it was a doubly invalid ruling that again was overturned. I want to ask you a little about teaching. Your teaching. I have one final question though about kind of, I guess, Sharia per se, but there's this notion that Newt Gingrich has been advancing that we have to worry about stealth jihadists in our midst, and I guess, and I think he purports to be grounding that concern in Islamic doctrine, and I gather there is, I think it has to do with deception being justified if you're doing it in the name of jihad or something. Does this ring a bell, or
Well, one of the terms that people like to talk about is the Arabic term taqiyya.
Right.
And the way it's described, in fact, in the report that we've been talking about, is that the way it's understood is that Muslims are required to lie, that Muslims need to lie in order to further their agenda, not only in jihad, but in any circumstance. And it's just crazy. I don't know where that idea came from. If you look at the notion of taqiyya, it's something that Shia and non-Shi'i Muslims alike have as part of their tradition, but it's definitely more part of the Shi'i tradition. And what it means, it's not the word's not translated as lying. It's translated as dissimulation, which is maybe another way of talking about how it is that people protect their identity when that they're being threatened with their life. So basically, the reason it's so more popularly understood in Shia Islam is that the Shia have been the minority within the Muslim world, and they've been persecuted. And so the basic idea of taqiyya, Bob, is that if you were a religious minority and you were brought up before a court, an inquisition, let's say, and said, hey, do you believe this? And if you do, we're going to kill you. You're allowed to say, no, I don't believe it. You're allowed to save yourself by denying a belief that you might in fact hold to be true, and that seems a perfectly reasonable position to me. You don't have to. You're not required to do that. You're allowed to say, no, I really do believe that. Please kill me and turn me into a martyr or whatever. But you're not required to do that. And so that seems to make sense to me, and it makes sense within a context where you have a religious minority that might in fact fear that that its number would be decimated if they continued to tell the truth and be persecuted. So
the idea you're hearing from kind of the Newt Gingrich, Frank Gaffney part of the world, that Taqfiyya, if I'm pronouncing it right, which I'm probably not, is kind of designed to be deployed to covertly prepare the ground for establishing Sharia and Islamic rule, and then, eventually kind of springing the trap. That just kind of has no basis in Islamic law, their claim?
No, it doesn't, Bob. It's just it's taking a concept from a classical, specific historical context. It's pulling it out of that context. It's reifying it. It's making it look to be ridiculous, and then also something to be feared by twisting it into something that it never was, nor in fact could be.
Kind of makes me wonder if I should trust these guys, but that's my editorial comment, not yours. Okay, I'm as I said, I want to ask you a little about your teaching. It's interesting to me that you're teaching this stuff at the U.S. Naval Academy, and of course I know, it's long been the case that there were things taught at the military academies other than, kind of fighting and engineering per se and military doctrine. But is there, you have a whole institute at the Naval Academy that you're running, the Center for the Middle East and Islamic Studies. Has there been an appreciably greater emphasis on studying Islam and Islamic cultures as a result of things like 9/11 in the military academies?
Well, Bob, it's a good question, and I think the short answer is yes, but the longer answer, which is a bit more accurate, is that the Naval Academy, as well as other academies, are educational institutions, and they want to maintain the highest quality of education, preparing young men and women to be leaders, whether in the military or also in our government and the business world. And so part of that education is making sure that they have international experience, that they understand different cultures around the world. Not that they become experts in any culture, but that they can understand how to interpret different cultures and how to interact with people from different cultures. And that includes language. It's very important that our young leaders learn how to speak other languages. It also includes immersion, going to other parts of the world and living there and seeing how it's different. But then, as you said, it also involves the curriculum itself. So at the U.S. Naval Academy over the past 5 or 6 years, there really has been an effort to try to increase the range of courses that are offered, to try to enrich the the environment and the opportunities that the midshipmen have to go abroad and to study different topics. And we're not changing the way that the midshipmen are educated, but we're enhancing what has been going on all along. And I would think any educational institution that just keeps the same curriculum year after year and doesn't change, it really is going to be behind the times.
Mm-hmm. And are there certain misconceptions that you find to be pretty common among students, and maybe students generally? You've taught at places other than Annapolis, but are there particular misconceptions that you find recurring kind of year after year that you wind up dispelling or trying to dispel?
Well, Bob, it's a really good question. And as you said, it's there's nothing I wouldn't say specific about teaching at the Naval Academy that brings this up. Although one of the things that I really appreciate being there is that we have students from all the 50 states and from the other U.S. territories, and we also have a number of international students there. So it's a really diverse student body, as opposed to a lot of state schools. You're generally drawing regionally from the people who live in that one specific area. So we do get a wider variety of perspectives in the classroom at the Naval Academy. But I would say in either case, it's really a reflection of the culture at large. It's a reflection of what these young people are hearing on the news or reading in the newspaper, and then whatever their own particular education might be. Mm-hmm. And my background as a scholar really is a historian of religion, and so I'm interested in the academic, comparative, secular study of religion and trying to understand where religion came from and how it functions in society and how we can understand it from a rational perspective. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that more so than specifically about Islam, you find a lot of students coming into college with not a lot of academic preparation to study religion. Mm-hmm. It's almost as though you would come into a chemistry class and say, well, I studied medieval alchemy before this, and now I'm ready to go. But it's a little different. We start by reading anthropologists and historians and sociologists, and not by talking about what we believe or what we might practice ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's no single thing or small number of things you can kind of count on being prevailing misconceptions in a.
Well, Bob, I think it really differs from student to student, and it seems to differ from year to year. But I think the misconceptions that I encounter personally in the classroom seem to be the same ones that I read about in the newspaper, I hear about in the news, and some of those are ones that we've talked about today. Mm-hmm. And I think partly that's because these are interpretations and positions that get a lot of volume. The people who make them are not necessarily in the majority, but they're able to get a lot of attention drawn to what they're saying. And so it has an effect, and even if it's the effect of being discussed in a critical way or being reported about in a news source, then that's going to have some traction.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, listen, thank you very much for taking the time. I guess I'll let you get back to preparing for. I guess tomorrow you have classes. Is Thanksgiving? Was there a Thanksgiving break that's now over?
Yes, we had a Thanksgiving break, and in fact, as you mentioned, the center we bring in speakers to speak to the midshipmen, and we have a speaker coming in tomorrow, and we're pretty excited about his presentation. So, and we have a couple more weeks of class, and then, of course, in 1 week's time. The most important event, perhaps, in the entire school year at the Naval Academy is our game that we're guaranteed to win against Army.
That kind of hurts because my father was a career Army officer, and so I grew up watching the Army-Navy game with my father, and it has not escaped my my consciousness that you're right. In recent years, Army has had very little luck, and they were forced to face Notre Dame, and that was in a nationally televised game. That was a pretty punishing exercise. So I've got to say we're not ending this conversation on what I consider a very positive note, but I can understand you're taking some joy in the likely outcome of that game, although I have not given up hope.
Well, I have to say too, my oldest son has just enlisted in the Army, so now I have several T-shirts that say Army on them as opposed to Navy. So.
Well, I hope you'll at least be ambivalent then about the outcome of the game.
Yeah, I will agree to that.
Okay. Well, thanks again for taking the time, Brannon.
Well, thank you, Bob. I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay. Take care.
All right, bye.